We say Pauline studies a breakdown. In brief, what is Pauline studies or Pauline scholarship? What is that?
Anything that is written that is concerned with the Apostle Paul, whether that be the historical Paul, that is the Paul usually of the 7 letters, and maybe the book of Acts, depending on how much scholars like Acts or don't like Acts. Or it can include all 13 letters attributed to Paul. It can include systematic theology, constructive theology, anything that touches the Pauline letters or the Pauline corpus or the historical Paul in terms of the book of Acts. Or if you push it back further into like the apocryphal Acts of Paul, like the Acts of Paul and Thecla and stuff like that. So basically anything that touches on Paul or is related to it. So you've got the issue of Second Temple Judaism, Enoch, Wisdom, Pseudo-Fossilides, and other texts. And the new thing is putting those writers in conversation with Paul, what is their view of the Gentile problem, right, so to speak, right? The problem of Gentiles and culture and stuff. And so you're starting to get more comparison between like Wisdom of Solomon and Paul and their use of Isaiah or something like that. And so you're seeing a lot. It's basically, it's a very expansive term, but at the center of it is the most contested person in the New Testament outside of Jesus himself, of course.
Should Grandma Jones going to church every Sunday care about what Pauline scholars say?
Most of them, she probably doesn't have to worry about what they say, no.
All right. What about let's go with the younger crowd? The savvy young millennial or mature Gen Zer. Should they care about what Pauline scholars say? They're a Christian now. That's the context of the question.
No, I get you. Yeah, I think so. Obviously, you can't be an expert in every single aspect of Paul. There's not enough hours in the day. My work in Paul is fairly limited in terms of what I'm specifically studying, working on. But yeah, it's one of those. For example, if Paul is the New Testament's earliest interpreter of the life of Jesus and the impact of Jesus's resurrection and death and stuff like that, and if he's writing between like the late 40s to the early 60s, so about 10 years or so, 13 years after Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection, he's the earliest written record we have in terms of time in relation to Jesus. And so what he thinks about Jesus is very important. And what people say he says is very important too, because you've got all sorts of contradictions and scholarly fights that people are dealing with. And so being aware of what's being said in the scholarly literature as much as you're able to do so will help you engage Paul better, specifically as it relates to modern issues of sex, gender, sexual ethics, Israel, war, violence, the state. It's one of those things, the more you read Paul, the more you realize as a pastor, because I think Paul was at heart a pastor at least in a substantial sense. Paul's dealing with churches and societies that are, if we're in the United States, are remarkably like ours. And so the only difference being he didn't have, as a Roman citizen, he had the right to some sort of legal, he had some legal constitutional power, so to speak. We wouldn't use constitutional, but that idea of he has representation, he's got some sort of voting right. But your average Christian in the first century didn't have that. Your average Christian in the first century was a Jew, and your control or power or say was limited to basically the geographical region. The emperor did not care how you voted because you didn't vote. You can vote your way into putting, St. Paul as your pope or as your viceroy, as your ambassador or whatever. And so Paul is writing in a time that's just like ours, dealing with issues that are shockingly just like ours, speaking to a culture that is shockingly like ours, at least in the United States and kind of the post-Christian growing secular West. And so thinking about what Paul says and what scholars say about Paul is important, because what Paul is saying is basically the birth of the church, or at least in a kind of formal ecclesial sense.
Sounds important to me. Okay, now, when we talk about Pauline scholars, can you help us understand what a Pauline scholar is in the first place?
Yeah, a Pauline scholar is someone where he or she has dedicated their academic life, to put it that way, in the study of Paul. Someone would be like this is Paul and the Gift, a book written by John Barclay.
Let me see real quick here. All right, what's this one about? I have I got a Barclay book, but I don't have that one. Go ahead.
Paul and the Gift by John M.G. Barclay. Barclay, he's a Pauline scholar, and his goal in life is to expound and apply and understand what Paul said in the first century and what that means for things. Yep, great book.
I do got this one, and which I think is really good, actually.
Yeah, it's a nice collection of a lot of his essays and articles. Really, really helpful stuff in there.
Yeah, that last chapter is where he does the whole N.T. Wright stuff. I believe it's, the last chapter. Anyway.
Yep, why the Roman Empire was insignificant to Paul?
Yeah.
Probably not the best title.
Well, I think I like titles that get people's attention, though. Okay, so help us understand what Pauline scholarship is.
It's basically scholarly work involving perhaps archaeology, kind of digging up the past literally. It can also involve translating Paul and understanding kind of linguistic issues in Paul. How does Paul use certain rhetorical devices? How does Paul use historical figures? How does Paul have when Paul uses Adam, does he use Adam in the same way that Philo would use Adam or use Moses as historical figures? How do they interpret these figures? How do they apply them? Romans 4, the famous passage about faith and circumcision with Abraham, right? Or Galatians 3, you got Abraham and his seed, kind of playing off that idea as well. A Pauline scholar, he or she basically simply looks at the world of Paul, the first century, with all the Greco-Roman influences, the Jewish influences, temple issues, how bodies were viewed, anthropologically, sexually, theologically, spiritually, and puts all that together and tries to construct what we might call a coherent, if they believe that, you can construct such a coherent thing, because there's debate about that too, a coherent vision of what a dead first century apostle of the crucified, resurrected Christ believed and or said and or did, or all of the above. So that's kind of, they are basically artists playing with history and science, trying to paint a picture of something, and that someone is dead, and we don't have access to his thoughts except for the things he physically left to us in his 7 to 13 epistles, which I think he wrote all 13, but there's debate there.
And so that's one of the big issues. Authorship of Paul. Talk about that briefly.
So you've got, Romans. If you pick up your Bible, you've got Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, and so on and so forth, and then you get to Philemon. So you run the gamut of all 13 letters. And what happens in that conversation is, about 200 or so years ago, there was a very strong kind of post-Enlightenment or Enlightenment-esque response to kind of the letters of Paul and the quote historical Jesus. The issues of what can we even know about history? Kind of what is history? It basically is the first massive kind of deconstruction era. You know what I mean? Kind of breaking things down, trying to be free from the dogmas of the past, while basically realizing you're tap dancing on the grave of lots of things that you didn't necessarily want to kill, so to speak. And there was debate amongst the Tübingen school, that is in Germany, F.C. Bauer, and him and his kind of contemporaries about 200 years ago said Paul is the only epistles we know Paul wrote were Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians. And even then, they chopped those up. Paul didn't write this section.
Yeah. I mean, I know they don't think Paul wrote it right, but especially 2nd Corinthians, they think that was like lots of pieces.
Yeah, they basically, that one, I've seen up to, I think there's your average scholar now is like, maybe it's 2 letters kind of together, 2 separate letters kind of smashed together. I've seen, up to 6 different partition theories. That's what they're called, kind of letters that are pieces or fragments that are smashed together, kind of cobbled together a little bit. But most, I would venture a guess, not even your most skeptical scholar outside of, the one person on the internet that, says stuff to get a rise out of people. Your average scholar in a seminary or a school of religion or university doesn't hold to that theory. The one theory that is, you might say, the majority view or kind of the mainstream view is that Paul wrote 7 of the letters. And so that would be the Romans, the 1-2 Corinthians, the Galatians, the 1st Thessalonians, the Philemon, and that's 6, I'm missing one. I remember. Galatians. Did I say Galatians? Galatians.
I think so.
But or maybe a better way of saying Ephesians, Second Thessalonians, and the three pastorals, and Colossians. Those are the six that are disputed, often called the Deutero-Pauline corpus. Basically, Paul is not the author of these. These are written at a later time. You can call that forgery. The standard term is pseudepigraphy, false writing. Not false, and depending on who you talk to, but not false writing with the intent to lie, but false writing in the sense of the author is not who the author says. And if that sounds like doublespeak, it kind of is, it kind of isn't. It really just depends on the scholar you talk to on that question.
Okay.
But that's kind of the majority view. Most evangelical scholars that I've talked to and I've read affirm all 13 or 10. The pastoral epistles are kind of the only within, I would say, broadly evangelicalism, from like the evangelical left to the evangelical right, or the fundamentalists, pick whatever label you want. The pastoral epistles are probably the only ones that are actually like, well, maybe Paul didn't write them, but, I think probably did. So there's gradations kind of within that. If you look at, for example, kind of the dean of evangelical scholarship, this is I. Howard Marshall. He taught at the University of Aberdeen for years and years.
In Scotland.
And if your favorite New Testament professor probably studied under Howard Marshall, if he or she's an evangelical, and studied overseas. He's basically that guy. He's kind of FBF Bruce, right? Just this titan amongst evangelicals, commitment to Scripture, commitment to the local church, like people that are genuine Christians. And Howard Marshall, in this one, the International Critical Commentary, does not believe Paul wrote these three epistles, the pastoral epistles, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, although he doesn't come down as strong as most kind of critical scholars would. He thinks there's some arguments, but he at the end tilts towards non-Pauline authorship. But then you have, and I don't have it with me here, is Luke Timothy Johnson, a liberal Roman Catholic scholar, who does think, and I think it's the Anchor Bible Dictionary commentary series. I don't remember where it is on my desk, but a liberal Roman Catholic scholar does believe Paul wrote them. And so you can see how the pastoral epistles are more kind of where the debate is, at least within kind of evangelicalism.
So I was trying to find I also got my Luke Timothy Johnson book somewhere around here.
It looks like this, except it's not Galatians.
No, yeah, I know. I got a different one. It's just I got all these books around my desk right now, and I don't want to go through the piles. Okay, so so there's a lot to this. I recently did I'm not a PhD student, but somewhat deep dive. Here, let me put us together here real quick, and feed the dog if I can find her treat there. Okay, yeah, there we go.
I was gonna say, but Adrian needs that snack, yo.
Yeah, here we go, Adrian. There we go. She's happy. Okay. I kind of did a deep dive recently to an extent into some of this because, as you know, because I was talking to you a lot, I had a debate recently, and it was on the idea of Paul being a secret Roman agent. So Jacob Berman is the person I debated. It was on Sonnetta's channel. But that idea, there's variations of that idea, and from my understanding, not really in Pauline scholarship proper. But even though that idea is bandied about by a few authors, so, he's got his buddy Jim Valiant has a book called Creating Christ that he co-wrote. And I guess the big boy in the situation would be Joseph Atwill, Caesar's Messiah. There's a whole website dedicated to it. Sometimes they call it the Flavian Thesis because the stronger versions get into essentially Rome created Christianity as a whole. Jacob has a hybrid version where he has the zealous Jesus movement being steered astray into a domesticated Roman-friendly religion. But there's variations within this. But what it does is, the reason why it's fascinating and interesting to me is because it relates to a larger set of issues that are relevant to every Christian. Really, I mean, my goodness, the Apostle Paul is one of the most influential men who's ever lived, especially if you're going to talk about within certain cultures or societies. And so his shadow looms large. So I say Christian to emphasize that, but really I think these issues have a broader importance, of course. So as I was looking into a lot of this stuff, I just saw the challenges reminded me of a little bit when I was dealing with the mythicists folks back when the neo-atheists started popping off, because one of their favorite theories at the time was Christ mythicism. And they're calling the Flavian Thesis, as it's sometimes called. It sounds too respectable, in my opinion, almost, considering how silly I find it to be. But they're calling it mythicism type 2 or type 2 mythicism, or some of the terms I've seen that are utilized in relationship to this. And so you and I talked about that. Now, the things we talked about more had to do with what I talked to Chris Samuel about a couple days ago, about the counter-cultural elements of Pauline theology, or you could phrase it different ways because there's stronger and softer versions of that. Of course, you already know this, but I'm talking to the audience too. And then it also relates to all kinds of issues that are important, and Pauline authorship. That's important. That matters, And of course, a lot of people are familiar with the Bart Ehrman stuff. And so Forged is a book where he talks about, the authorship isn't this, it isn't that. And that's just one, he's just kind of like amassing, it seems like to me, general consensus of non-confessional and sometimes confessional New Testament scholars. But I said, man, there's so much here. Let's try to update people on what's going on in the academy, because it leaks onto the internet. So years ago, Nick, I never would have imagined that I would turn on this internet and then you would see kind of a regular YouTube guy. So this wouldn't be like a Duke University Divinity School or something channel or a platform. This would be like just a guy who has a YouTube channel, and I would see Bart there being interviewed by him. I never thought that would happen. But now that's all over. That's a lot. You have James Tabor everywhere, Robert Eisenman everywhere, Bart Ehrman everywhere, and I'm just naming a few. There. And so it's interesting now to see elements of like scholarship leaking onto the internet, but I don't feel like the balance is represented, because I think, Nick, and I want you to talk about this right here if you can, if you watch just the internet channels that emphasize this, you would have a view that's a lot more radical and skeptical, I think, than even standard non-believing views, for example, if that makes sense, because they tend to emphasize the sensationalistic and conspiratorial type thesis proposals first, it seems like. So within that, have you spent much time looking at some of these channels that emphasize, attacking elements of Pauline scholasticism or those kinds of questions? And can you talk about the disconnect and the connects between the internet and the academy, so to speak, please? I know that's a lot, but I know you're a smart guy. You know what I'm saying.
I could try. So there is a tendency, and I don't think you see it as much in Pauline studies. If you look at, peer review literature, like say like a New Testament studies, or a journal of biblical literature, or a journal for the study of the New Testament, and kind of, your standard peer-reviewed journals, you will find theories or theses kind of trotted out a little bit, but usually it's very reserved. Usually it's very much in conversation. Usually those are more focused on paper presentations at like SBL, AAR, even ETS, depending on the thesis.
Tell people real quick what those things stand for, you just said.
So ETS is the Evangelical Theological Society, SBL is the Society of Biblical Literature, and AAR is the American Academy of Religion. AAR is kind of, think your history of religions school, schools, and like Bart Ehrman attends there, but Bart Ehrman would be probably considered a conservative at AAR. He'd be in the mainstream at SBL, and he'd be a wackadoodle liberal at ETS, if that helps kind of paint a picture. The problem with a lot of this is twofold. One, it's a good thing, and two, it's a bad thing. One is you're seeing scholarly material being more easily accessed by people. The fact that Michael Bird will come on my YouTube channel and talk with me for an hour is shocking. That normally wouldn't have happened. There was kind of that distinct separation, and that's kind of broken away. So there's a bit more diffusion of scholarship at that point, which is really, really helpful. On the negative side of that, you have someone who is a scholar coming on to talk with someone who's not a scholar, and it becomes very noticeable very quickly that, and I'm not trying to be rude to folks, you can tell the scholar is being guided into a conversation that the YouTuber is trying to go because it's esoteric, it's clickbait, it's weird, it's interesting, aliens, man, that sort of stuff. And there is this sense of which what is acceptable in the academy in terms of putting forth interesting or novel or weird ideas is done in a conference room filled with your peers. You know what I mean? People that they all agree that, they may not agree on anything. You could have a Muslim, an atheist, five Muslims, five atheists, five evangelical Christians, five liberal Protestants, UMC, PCOSA, pick your poison. And you got all of them sitting there and they're all arguing about, First Clement and how First Clement talks about this, talks about baptism or something like that. And so you get pushback, you get kind of sharpening of theses, you get the wackadoodle stuff tends to get kind of pushed away, and you get something that's a little more nuanced or careful or what have you. That simply doesn't happen on YouTube. Generally speaking, of course, you have exceptions. If Michael Bird and Nijay Gupta, who's a professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary, sit down and they go through Galatians together, you're not going to get a lot of fringe theories there, but you're going to have, some people say this and you'll have disagreements, but they kind of stay within the highway, so to speak. They don't go down the dirt roads off the highway. Whereas on YouTube, because of in social media, you do have this propensity towards shock, sensationalism, clicks, that the most wackadoodle theories will be put forth out there, not within the confines of an academic conversation, but as a monologue. And that's usually where I think the issue is. And that, that can happen with anyone. Like I'm not, someone had me come on to talk about something that I think is true, but is not mainstream or mainline. Then, that could very easily devolve into that sort of thing. So I'm not saying I'm immune from that or anyone else is, but you can see how a one-to-one conversation on YouTube is far different than when proposing an argument or paper at a scholarly convention, where there is that give and feedback, that pushback in those fights. So I don't know if I've answered it correctly or best or very well, but that's kind of generally speaking some of the good things about what the current realm of YouTube and scholarship and all of that. And I think some of the negative impact of it as well.
Okay, yeah, no, that was a fine answer. Earlier, my man over here asked me if I could turn up Nick. Nick, are you able to turn yourself up, or are him and I relatively level, or is he that much quieter than me?
I can also move forward a little bit.
Maybe people want to hear you, brother.
Okay, I don't have any buttons here that I can play with. It's just straight out.
I got you, because I've got your volume all the way up. I have your volume all the way up.
I'll scoot forward a little. That might help.
I wonder if it'll help if I turn myself down. We'll try to evenly match ourselves here. Okay, how about now? How are we now, everybody? Let me know.
All right, let me see. I'll talk. Oh boy, this apple juice is fantastic. I can't get enough of it. Oh my goodness.
By the way, Walsh, I'm thinking of doing tomorrow sometime a year in review of what's happened in Hebrew Israelism in 2023. If I do that, would you like to join me? I'll talk to you later about it again, but it just kind of came to me in the shower today. Okay, now we've got a question from Facebook. Rob Barnhart wants to know, what is this man's credentials? He's talking to
you. Bachelor of Arts in Film from Biola, 2011, I think. Master of Arts in Biblical Studies from Fuller Seminary in 2017. And I've been a PhD student at Ridley College, specifically within the Australian College of Theology, PhD in New Testament under Michael Bird. So those are my credentials. And for those who care, I'm ordained in the American Baptist Churches USA, specifically the Southwest region. For those who care about those credentials, I care almost as much about that than I do my doctoral work.
Okay, excellent. And Nate says I accidentally called you the wrong name. I don't know why I do that. I apologize. For some reason, sometimes I call Nick Matthew.
I forgot my wife's name one time in conversation with her, so I don't take any offense to that.
Well, as long as you didn't say another lady's name, it's probably okay.
No, I just did the you, my wife, Allison. Yeah, took a sec.
Okay. So how long before we can call you Dr. Quint, speaking of names? How soon is that going to be?
Well, I've got 7 chapters due. First chapter is done and been signed off. Mike gave me the check mark on that. So I got 6 more chapters to write. Chapter 3 is mostly written in kind of a bare bones section. Chapter 2 is going to be tough. I have to go through Second Temple Jewish literature and do my own translational work. Probably have to learn a little bit of languages that I don't know, which will be fun. And
really? Do you have to learn Aramaic or something?
Stuff like that.
Or are you talking German?
Well, I have to learn German. I'm learning German very slowly. But it's a research degree, so you learn as much as you need in order to do what you have to do with your degree. The problem is in my subject, I need to translate. Well, I've got this book. No one has this book on their shelf. This is Ernst Käsemann, New Testament Questions of Today by Fortress Press. This was probably how long? Oh,
That's an old school book right there.
Yep, library book too.
Doesn't his name have the little 2 dots above the E or something like that?
His last name is Cheeseman in German. Yes, it does. The 2 dots.
Yeah, because I see it cited, and the last time I saw it cited, the scholar said something like the simply titled yet wonderful. It was like they're trying to contrast how important the book was with its title, which is not very romantic,
No, but yeah. So funny. I'll have to go back and look. I'm technically. Oh gosh. Let me see. Stall for me for like 30 seconds, vocab. Let me see.
Oh, that's easy. I can do that in a jiffy, man. Okay, so check it out, everybody. Listen. Crazy thing happened today. I had somebody contact me, and they said, "Hey, I'm willing to put up and pay Jim Valiant $300 if he'll debate you." No joke. And they said he can host it on History Valley's channel, Jacob Berman, if he would like. So I said, what? So I got a hold of Jacob right away. I said, yo, this guy is saying, and it's someone I know, so they're serious about it. I've been talking to. Hey, tell Jim I have a donor who's willing to pay him $300 to do a debate on your channel. So it's in a territory that he's just used to, it's not some Christian platform. Almost immediately, the text reply came back. He declines. Almost immediately. He's declined. Jim's declined. This guy, Jim Valiant is out there banning about his books because he's also a wannabe Ayn Rand scholar, objectivist, if you know about all those folks. And apparently, he's also got problems in that area as well. It's not just problems with Paul. He's got problems with what he does in that side of his career as well. But I don't understand how a man who has education, I've looked up his credentials, has written, is a former practicing attorney, I don't know if he's still practicing, will not debate the thesis of his book for $300. The thesis I propose, and I'm willing to be flexible, is can the Flavian Thesis withstand historical scrutiny? So he would say yes, and I would say no, and then we would have a timed, moderated debate. If we wanted to, I would even be willing to eliminate cross-examination questions, which I would think a lawyer would love. But if the attorney turned historical author doesn't want to have that, then we won't even have to interact. We'll literally just be, I read my stuff, he reads his stuff. It sounds like he's not willing to do it, which I find him to be a coward of the worst kind. The kind who comes on and talks big, but the second they're pushed back on just a little bit, literally runs off the platform. And if you know what I'm talking about, watch when I came on Paradigm Shift TV last night and Jim literally left. He said, I won't be on here if he's on here. It was wild. Well, since Jim's turned that down, Jim and Jacob, if you watch this, and I like Jacob, so this is nothing personal, by the way. What about this? What about a written debate? If you're too afraid to do a video debate, would you do a written or audio only debate, like on a podcast, for example? So no cameras, you can whatever, if that's a problem for you, like when you get angry at me and you turned red, people won't be able to see it. So what about audio only? What about written only? I'm really trying here, Jim. But so far, no dice. This guy. Okay. Sorry, thank you for taking a small break so I could talk some trash, Nick. I appreciate that.
By all means, happy to do it. So I couldn't find it.
People are saying, Benjamin says, we're going to make the apologist hat a thing.
Straight from Scotland, by the way. When my wife went over for her doctoral stuff at Aberdeen, she brought this back for me.
Mine's Irish.
Oh, even better.
Now, just so you know, everyone, I don't have one drop of Irish blood. Thank God.
So So I've got this thing where Mike said this to me, Mike Bird, my supervisor, and it was, y'all are fifth generation Bultmannians. Rudolf Bultmann, famous German New Testament. We would consider a liberal German New Testament scholar.
Demythicize the New Testament.
Which, if you actually think about it, what he was trying to do was his own form of apologetics, because in his
liberals often do, right?
Yep. And so I'm sympathetic to the idea. If the execution, definitely not. But I'm more sympathetic, and I see what you were trying to do, but crash and burn. But at least I can understand the heart of the matter. But so Nick Quint and the other students, student of Michael Bird, student of, I think it's either Robert Webb or Rick Strayland. Rick Strayland, student of Ernst Käsemann, and Ernst Käsemann, student of Rudolf Bultmann. So I am within the Bultmann strain, basically, which is, I find very, very entertaining, considering what I believe and what Bultmann did not believe. But I do love Ernst Käsemann. He's the granddaddy of modern Pauline apocalyptic, so I like him.
How about Jeremias? Isn't that how you say his name? It's like
I heard pronounced as Jeremias, but I don't know.
Seriously?
I don't know if that's right. That's what I heard. I don't know.
That's do you like him? Because I like him.
I like him. He's on the conservative side of things. I like. So I liked him. I thought he was interesting. He hasn't. A lot of his stuff hasn't stood up just because of the field he wrote in. There's been a lot of advances in Second Temple literature, geography, understanding of that sort of stuff. So his stuff tends to be a little less relevant in terms of today, but still, very good for its time, and left a lasting impact in a good way. So I like him. Unfortunately, he just doesn't come up in the literature a whole lot anymore.
Well, all right. Since we're doing that, how about this part of the show? I put a book in front of you that in some way I think is relevant to Pauline studies, right? Mm-hmm. And if you know something about it or the author, so can just give a brief off-the-cuff review. And if you recommend it to people in the channel for apologetics help.
Okay.
And if you don't recommend it for apologetics help, maybe you'll say no, but I recommend it for budding scholars or something like that. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
Ready? All right. First off, we start with Acts in its Hellenistic setting. I know I'm giving my version of the subtitle. Colin J. Himmer, what say thee?
Probably it's good, and it's good for the purpose of apologetics. It's dated, and it's not dated in a bad way. But if you want kind of current Acts scholarship, Craig Keener is. I mean, if you can't afford his 4-volume, set that's like 10,000 pages. Yeah, you can't afford that. But he's got a commentary in, I think it's Cambridge, and it's about maybe a little bigger than this. It's probably 400 pages. It's actually probably the size of something like this. I would go with that. But if you had that on your shelf, the Hemmer book, by no means bad and will perfectly be suitable for that purpose. But Keener is the most up-to-date, as I know it, in terms of that question.
We already did Barclay, right?
Mm-hmm. Definitely not for apologists. That's a budding scholar's book.
Okay. Hold on, just give me a second here. Oh. Josephus, Judaism, and Christianity, Louis Feldman. That might be sort of out of the Paul stuff. It's more on the Jesus stuff, but there's some Paul stuff in here.
I haven't read it and I don't recognize the authors. It looks interesting. My sense is, unless a book has directly been repudiated because it's bad scholarship, read the book.
Gotcha. Well, so like for example, he's got it's a multi-volume, The Works of Josephus and the Early Christian Church. So, because that's of course a thing now. What do you think of that idea? The idea that Luke borrowed from Josephus?
I don't think much of it. I don't think a lot of scholars do either. I think it's just harder to prove. It assumes a very late date of the Book of Acts, one that I'm not sure is entirely justified.
No, okay. Well, because I know Steve Mason likes it.
Although I could be wrong. Josephus, I don't remember quite when Josephus wrote his Antiquities or Jewish Wars.
Yeah, I agree with your initial assessment, by the way, just from me. But this is Steve Mason, so he has some good work in relationship to Josephus. But this idea of the Luke borrowing, to me, I think is problematic. One of the big things that has to do with is, I also always have it's Theudas within the Book of Acts. That's like the big problem or challenge there, and they tend to favor Josephus over Luke there. But there's a whole chapter in that called Josephus and Luke Acts. All right, hold on.
Certainly worth reading.
So this one, now if you don't know the book, authors...
I know this one. It's a good book. It's a little older, but it's a good book. It's a good book.
So the reason I put this one out in relationship to Paul is specifically its chapter related to things that Paul said that echoed Jesus. Can you talk about that in general? That's one of the main reasons I put this to you, that idea, Paul and Jesus' relation.
Well, actually, there's a new book that just came out on that. Well, not just, but probably 2015 I don't have it on my shelf, but I think it's actually called When Paul Met Jesus. And it's by Stan Porter out of McMaster Divinity College up in Canada. I have a couple chapters downloaded. I've read portions of it. I think he's actually right that Paul probably met Jesus in the flesh before his encounter with Jesus in the Book of Acts. Porter makes a really good case based on a few different texts that I thought were helpful. So I would. The Jesus Legend's a good book. It's a little dated, but it doesn't mean it's bad. It just means stuff has moved on. The closest thing would be something like this. That'd be probably the most current.
Lycona's?
Well, actually not. Yeah, or at least there's stuff. I think that the strength of Lycona's book personally is the first 200 pages just on historiography. I thought in historical method and philosophy. That's where I think the book is helpful. This other stuff I was like, read N.T. Wright's book on the resurrection. I think it's stronger. But his stuff on methodology, I think it's fantastic.
Notice, everyone, how so many of the books, I'll put out and be like, here's this. Someone who's currently doing a PhD in New Testament, specifically Pauline studies, they're going to say it's dated. So it's kind of tough. I got to tell you, from like a person who compared to a regular person, not compared to a person who's a full-time seminary teacher, books I have access to or that I own, it's a decent library. But then it's like when you talk to someone that's currently doing the PhD, it's like, well, that's dated because the field moves.
Yeah, and not for the better, actually. Like you and I talked offline about Martin Hengel, right? And Martin Hengel was a fantastic German New Testament scholar, just absolutely fantastic. And a lot of what he's arguing now is, and when we use the phrase dated, that's a good point. It doesn't mean wrong, or it doesn't mean supplanted, or crucifixion. Yeah, great book. It doesn't mean it's wrong or it's been disproved. It just means scholarship has kind of built on this, refined it, tweaked it, nuanced it, and has kind of moved on from it. And so, kind of the idea of if you're building a house, that Martin Hengel's book on the crucifixion is an excellent brick that withstood the weight of time, so to speak. So it doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that you have to look at the whole house now. This one,
another Hengel book, Paul Between Damascus and Antioch: The Unknown Years. This is actually co-authored with Anna Maria Schweimer, and I was always shocked. He's professor emeritus of New Testament and early Judaism at Tübingen. And to all of you guys who've got into this before, because the whole point of this, everyone, if you're wondering what's going on this channel, the whole point is to introduce you to some of these things. And you kind of realize, whoa, there's a bigger world out there in relationship to this stuff. It's not to discourage you or intimidate you. It's to show you, oh, there's a lot to this. There's a lot going on. And so to me, that's always exciting and challenging and encouraging. And I like stuff like that. Some people are just like, I shut it down. I can't take it. But that's kind of what we're doing a little bit. But if you even have a passing interest in some of the higher critical type stuff within New Testament scholarship, you can't escape reading the name Tübingen. The school in Germany, Tübingen. You'll see it again and again and again and again. And some people feel like, oh, that's in the vein of Martin Luther. They're like, we got to keep on refining and keep on reforming and keep on Protestantisming. But they chisel it down to where the New Testament's a kernel in your hand, and that's the historical Jesus now. Once they're done with them, you know what I mean? But how in the world did Martin Hengel survive at Tübingen all those years? That's what I want to know.
I don't know. I mean, Hengel, at the end of the day, you had Barth. So I'm reading a really good a biography of Karl Barth, one of the most famous, probably theologians. Like if you're constructing a dream team of 10 systematic theologians of all time in Christian history, Barth is on there. What's good, Chris?
I'm still probably a little bit conservative in my blood to where I'll say, okay, yeah, that's what you guys say, but I don't think I ever appreciated Barth the way everyone else that wrote about him seemed to appreciate him. I guess I'm just too dumb.
Yeah.
Huh?
No, I have a love-hate relationship with him. I think what Barth did well was that he grabbed liberal German theology like that and yanked it back toward orthodoxy with, both fingers. The problem is, of course, and he was virulently anti-Nazi at a time when, for example, I just read, you had to begin in 1933 or 1934, he was in Germany. I forget exactly which university. All the universities were public. There's very little private seminaries in the area, so to speak. And you had to give I'm not going to do it because I don't want someone to clip it, but you had to pay homage to Hitler.
We understand what you're saying.
Yes.
You don't need to do charades with us.
No. I've been on the internet long enough. I've learned. But you had to do that at the beginning of class. Every public servant had to do it. So and that included professors because Barth was at a public university. And he refused to do it. And that eventually led to him being terminated from his position at, I forget which university it was, might have been Bonn, I forget exactly. And so he stood up to the state at that time and all that sort of stuff. And so I got a lot of love for him on that front. I think he had some stones when others didn't. But then he also was pretty grotesque in his personal life too. Some men are monsters and some men are monstrous, and he was pretty monstrous in many ways. But
actually, a lot of the stuff you just said, that's not the stuff I was actually aware of. So that was actually a fascinating little biographical snippet of Barth. That was fascinating. I will say this about Barth, sort of just on the academic level from what I saw. I think what it is, I was kind of joking a little bit earlier, is you have to be hypersensitive, I think, to the academic and cultural context, like the sort of scholastic environment at the time, to have some a sympathetic reading to appreciate him. Because if you're reading him outside of that context and you're like, okay, what's he actually saying here? Mm-hmm. If you're trying to be faithful and confessional and, you're thinking along those lines, I think it's like, well, this ain't really helping too much. But I feel like in an atmosphere of radical skepticism, it's almost like even the faintest praise or the smallest course correction is important. And of course, the classic quote about his commentary on Romans that it dropped a bombshell on the playground of scholars or whatever. Yeah, there you go. Now, on this side of things, I'm like, if I'm going to preach on Romans or teach on Romans or do a debate regarding Romans, I'm not probably going to pick up Barth. But again, that's where I just say, well, that's just me. So it's kind of trying to appreciate it in its time, I think. But Well, enough about him. Okay. Now I want to move on to. I still want to do the book review, and after this, I want to show you some clips. By the way, so guys, we're still having fun over here on this channel, and yes, I am going to give you a chance here to ask questions of Nick Quint, the New Testament theologist, and I do encourage you to check out his YouTube channel. He does stuff a little bit different than me, but I think you'll be able to appreciate some of the things that he does. So check it out and tell me what you think. And yes, Joel, we were talking about Karl Barth. I guess when you pronounce it, you don't really say the H, I guess, is the deal. I always hear it just Bart.
I've heard it Bart. So there's a little bit extra at the T. So instead of Bart, like Bart Simpson, it's Bart. That's how I've been told it. Who knows anymore. He's dead. He doesn't care.
So understand, I'm an apologist, and I'm thinking about a book that a somewhat normal person could read and benefit from. So you as the PhD student probably you're going to think in a different way, and I understand that. But the next book I'm going to say, if you even dip your toe into this field we're talking about, I'm going to say I think this is a book you have to have on your shelf. The other books are books you can have and look at or whatever, in my opinion. So it's this. It's the historical reliability in the New Testament.
I have it on my shelf.
Countering the Challenges to Evangelical Christian Beliefs by Craig Blomberg. I love this book. I think he gives you a basic rundown of the issues with good apologetic resources. And I like the way he writes and presents stuff. So I love Blomberg. I have an opinion of Blomberg. My little opinion is that he's undervalued and underappreciated. And I just love this book, and I can't imagine any Christian that would not benefit from this. And so I highly encourage you guys to consider this book. And yes, it's big, but guys, here's the way it works with these books. You read the chapter or the part that's relevant that you need to study at the time. I haven't read this entire book. I've read lots of chapters in this, and some multiple times before I read another one. I've read some chapters twice. But I'm supposed to let you review the book, so go ahead.
I think it's good. I think Blomberg does a really good job of avoiding kind of the fringe. He kind of, if you're like me and you barbecue and do a lot of smoke, smoking on the grill and stuff like that, you need to cut off a lot of fat and just throw it away. You know what I mean? He does a really good job of kind of looking at conservative fundamentalism and liberal fundamentalism and kind of being, all right, we can kind of shave some of this off. There's enough in the middle for us to all have a reasonable conversation on. He doesn't oversell conservatism, and he doesn't denigrate the progressives when they're right or if he thinks they have value. He's a very clear-minded, very fair-minded thinker. Another book that's similar to that's not apologetically focused, is this one. The World of the New Testament by Joel Green and Lee Martin McDonald. And it's not immense. It's 500 pages, but it's also made up of 44.
Only a PhD student would say it's not immense. It's 500 pages.
No, well, because there's almost 45 chapters. So the chapter to page ratio is about 8 to 10 pages a chapter. So it's not super in depth. It's not super nerdy. They go through cynics, stoicism, just kind of, if you don't want to pick up Craig Keener's massive, thing or all the big things, this was in 2013. You've got stuff on Josephus, Philo, the Roman soldiers, Greco-Roman religion, philosophical schools, economics. One chapter in here that was interesting was on healthcare in the ancient world. So stuff like that to, give you kind of a sense of kind of the world of the New Testament, helps with some chronology stuff. That's, that's the one I found very helpful, and it's actually pretty cheap on Amazon. I remember it being like for a 500-page book or so, like $20.
Okay,
and,
okay.
So that one I thought was good. It's helpful. It's simple but not simplistic.
Next up, do you know this?
I've not read this one.
Okay, then I'll shoot.
Who's the author? I can't.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I'm going to shoot the authors at you. Okay.
Okay.
Matthew is Michael Wilkins. Mark is Craig Evans. And here's the one I want to mainly talk about. Luke Acts is Darrell Bach. John is Andreas Kostenberger. The Holman Apologetics Commentary in the Bible. So I just recommended Keener as a must-have. For me, the other must-have is this one. I mean, it's such a beautiful idea. I love the idea of an apologetics commentary. And you heard the people that are writing there. Evans, Bach. I don't know Wilkins as well. Kostenberger, whom
Wilkins is at Talbot. He's in the top echelon of Matthew scholars in evangelicalism.
Okay.
And incidentally, Darrell Bach studied, I think, under Howard Marshall at Aberdeen. So you can thank Howard Marshall for Darrell Bach, basically.
Okay, he's probably like the closest continuation in a way or something, maybe.
Well, him, and there's like Howard Marshall and FF Bruce, like you've got dozens of scholars that came from FF Bruce, Howard Marshall, like Donald Hagner at Fuller.
Okay.
Here's a great one. So you have Thomas Schreiner at Southern Seminary.
He's probably my favorite New Testament theologian for me.
Yeah, I have his apostle of Pauline, I have his Pauline theology over there. I disagree with like 80% of it, but when he's right, he's absolutely right.
Of course.
He has a section on universal salvation, and I got to deal with it. I'm not a universalist, but I have to engage with it, and Schreiner's a good one to engage with. But Schreiner's at Southern. He is the student of Donald Hagner at Fuller, and I met Donald Hagner, who's a Matthews and Hebrews guy. And Donald Hagner was a student of FF Bruce. And so you can see most of your favorite scholars today, if they are New Testament scholars, probably owe a debt of gratitude to either FF Bruce or Howard Marshall.
So that's interesting. So I didn't know that. I did know this. I did know this is my general layman's understanding. For the longest time, when I say we, I'm talking about evangelicals, basically, confessional, classic Orthodox Christians with a small o. We didn't really have a lot of PhDs, especially in the biblical studies realm. And basically, it was like if you were around in the, 50s or whatever, maybe 40s and 60s, whatever, I'm trying to get my dates here. You had to read FF Bruce stuff. Not that you had to, but that's kind of like, that was if you wanted something to help you instead of just attack you, it was FBF Bruce. And I got 2 books by FF Bruce I'm throwing out here. Spreading Flame, which is like a church history, and of course his classic of Paul, Apostle of the Heart Set Free. Yeah. A lot of his books had those old 70s covers. You got one too on you? What do you got?
FF Bruce's New Testament history is dated, but in the good sort of way, where he kind of goes through kind of everything outside the New Testament historically that would impact the New Testament. FF Bruce was interesting. He never got a doctorate. He taught at, I think it was at Manchester, University of Manchester in England for a long time. He
never got a doctorate? I didn't know that.
Nope, never got a doctorate. He had tons of masters and bachelor's degree. In the UK system, a master's degree is similar to a doctoral degree because a lot of it's research based. And so, for example, in Australia is the same way. Often they have you do a master's degree on your way to a PhD, and they kind of fold into each other, so to speak. But here's what I have about FF Bruce. This is called FF Bruce: A Life by Tim Grass.
Let's see. Let me see that crew cut again. Is that a crew cut or what?
That's smooth.
Oh, okay. I see it now. Okay. Oh, wow.
But FF Bruce.
His name was like Frederick or something, right?
Frederick Fivey Bruce.
Yeah, Frederick Fivey Bruce. But you guys even when I first got into apologetics, like a lot of the books I got in the beginning were actually FF Bruce books, because even then there wasn't a bunch of stuff. Now, and
they're old and cheap. That's the best part. They are old and cheap.
Old and cheap, yeah.
Still good.
Good point. Back in the day, it was different. Now you can throw a rock and hit a Christian evangelical New Testament scholar. In fact, I can almost do that with you.
Yeah, you're pretty close. You're a 5-hour drive from me, so that's not terrible.
I'm just saying, like, it's a different type of situation now. And it's very fascinating, very interesting. But for a long time, FF Bruce and then I Howard Marshall, that's what we had. That's who we had to go with, Okay, so...
Go ahead. Yeah.
But it's good. I like hearing people say positive things about FF Bruce. That warms my heart. Since we're doing old school and we're talking Paul, let's go really old school and talk Paul. The Origin of Paul's Religion by J. Gresham Machen.
It's a classic, but it is dated both in scholarship and in... It's old and it's worth reading, but it's one of those you read it, you're like, this is just...
When you say dated, it's 90 98, about to be 99 years old. This book is 99 years old.
Well, there's actually some books. There was a book. Was it a book or an article? I can't remember what it was. In the 1920s, by I'm going to butcher the name, but George Foot Moore. And it was the precursor to the New Perspective on Paul, which basically blew up in the 1970s. But he was, in the 1920s, he was basically recognizing that first century Judaism was not like the Roman Catholic Church, concerned with works-based religion and stuff like that. Or that was kind of his argumentation. And
it was variegated.
Yes. That's as some people say.
That's the word, bro. That's the word.
That's what Carson and them say, yes.
I know. That's our word. It's variegated.
I just say it's complex. It's more complex.
I like variegated because I know I'm referencing a 2-volume book set that I've read.
Yeah, if you just cut out Carson's final chapter, it's probably the best 2-set volume series evangelicalism's produced. So I'll just say that.
Think so? You just don't like the final chapter?
It's one of those chapters where if you read everything up into that, you're like, this is complex. They bring out stuff that E.P. Sanders missed or, got wrong. And they're writing about a guy, who wrote in the 70s. And then Carson kind of comes in, with a flamethrower and torches Sanders. I'm like, okay, hold on. Like,
it's funny you say that though, because
far the other way is what Carson did.
It's funny you're saying that though, because when I first heard the book recommended, they said, look, if you can't afford the 2-volume set, just just rent it out at the library and read Carson's chapter only.
Yeah. Well, Jimmy Dunn did. I think the book's actually called The New Perspective on Paul, and he includes a chapter response to Carson and the volume. And he didn't go as far as Sanders. Basically, Sanders. Okay, so for those who don't know, you've got 4 main schools of thought. And I'll give you the breakdown in about 30 seconds. One is called the Lutheran Paul, or the old perspective on Paul. Think, and I'm being crass when I say this. This doesn't represent everyone, but think the Calvinist reading of Paul, right? That's kind of generally what people say. I'm not saying that's how it is, but that's generally how it goes. Then you've got the new perspective on Paul, which basically tries to situate Paul back into savage, Nate. Situate Paul back in the first century, trying to ask first century questions, right, about Judaism. They got stuff wrong too. Then you've got the apocalyptic school, which is where I fall into, that basically says we need to ask different questions, and we're talking about, in the incarnation, an invasion of God back into a hostile world. So kind of John 1-esque. And then you've got Paul within Judaism, which essentially, a book like this, A Jewish Paul by Matthew Thiessen, and they basically go, anything that smells like Nicaea, and I'm being overly simplistic just for the sake of time, anything that smells like Nicaea or Chalcedon or kind of Christian confessionalism in Paul is not that. You know what I mean? And so they kind of try to evacuate any sort of trace of kind of Christian Orthodox readings of Paul by basically saying Paul's a Jew, he's not a Trinitarian, so the stuff about the Spirit doesn't have relation, all that sort of stuff. And so you've got those 4 kind of main schools of thought kind of fighting right now in the academy. E.P. Sanders inaugurated, actually no, was it E.P. Sanders? I forget. Jimmy Dunn and E.P. Sanders in the 70s basically created the new perspective on Paul based on the
Sanders was first. I mean, the Jesus and Judaism or whatever.
Yes, but he didn't coin the term.
Wasn't it Stendhal or something?
Stendhal, the famous essay is The Introspective Conscience of the West or something like that. And he was at Harvard. And he put his finger on the problem, even if I don't think he solved it. And that's kind of what Pauline scholarship a lot of times is you found out that there's a problem here. Did you solve it? No. We'll solve it in 30, 40, 50 years, maybe. Maybe not at this point. But they're going off of George Foot Moore in the 1920s. And so you can see the line of succession kind of through that. And until this really kind of happened, you had the old reading of Paul. And then when that came up, you've got everyone from E.P. Sanders, Jimmy Dunn, who is also kind of like a Howard Marshall. He's not as orthodox as Howard Marshall, or wasn't. He's passed on. He's since passed away. And N.T. Wright, who is still with us, thankfully. And so you have those 3 figureheads who cannot be more diverse on their views of, say, Paul's Christology, and all that sort of stuff, figuring out how all that works. And so you can see how long a lot of this scholarly stuff goes. And so when I say dated, it doesn't mean wrong. It just means scholarship has moved on and has either built upon the book, like George Foot Moore or Christopher Stendhal or E.P. Sanders, or we've basically smashed there's no value to the brick anymore. Machen is probably in between. If you're within the old perspective reading and are still fighting about the new perspective, then Machen is fantastic for that. Most scholars today don't read Machen, and I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying in terms of where things have moved on.
Well, key for me why I wanted to get this little one was chapter 7. I know you can't see it that well. These old books are typeset weird, but it's redemption in pagan religion and in Paul. So I that's helpful for like a lot of these conscious community guys and that kind of thing. And so I was glad he talked about it with the people who were pushing it back then at that day, because actually, interestingly enough, some of the people who push it these days get some of their stuff from people who were pushing it back then. Now, I'm not really talking about as much in the academy. I'm talking about in these YouTube streets, as it were. Now, we mentioned it briefly, but tell me more. I love this commentary on Acts, and everyone should understand why Acts is important within Pauline studies, or some people might say, or not. But tell me about Darrell Bock and his work and his commentaries.
Yeah, if you will not, ever since Howard Marshall did his Luke Acts materials, you won't find, and he's since passed on, you won't find a better student of his, and conservative evangelical. And I don't use that pejoratively as someone who is an evangelical. There is at this point, with the exception of maybe one of my PhD friends, who's also at Ridley. I won't mention him because he probably won't like it, but he's doing his stuff on Luke Acts. And if his thesis is correct, I think that will actually be of a lot of value to the apologetics community. Talk to me in about 3 years, and then I'll talk to him. But yeah.
As long as you haven't turned into a heretic by then, sure. I'm just kidding. I talk to heretics all the time. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Presbyterian.
Now let's get to our favorite. Let's get to our favorite, Stanley Porter. This book, of course, is Paul and Acts. He's doing some hardcore, high-level stuff. I don't think everyone's recognizing as much as they should. I mean, is he really the number one in a way, if in your mind?
Well, he's Yes. On the one hand, what is good about Porter, and I'll say this, Stan Porter, and I haven't had a chance to meet him yet. I've emailed him extensively. Stan Porter is actually one of the few scholars who's an expert in a lot of the major issues. So Paul and Acts, that's its own field, right? That's its own beast. The book of Acts is its own beast. Textual criticism is its own beast. Verbal aspect in Greek, own beast.
Real quick, verbal aspect in Greek. What's that?
So verbal aspect in Greek is a new way of conceiving how time and perspective are communicated in Greek. So often when we think of, if you've ever learned Greek, you know of the aorist tense, which usually is generally said to be an event in the past, kind of a past tense verb. At verbal aspect, if I've understood it correctly, and I'm still figuring it out, I wasn't taught it in seminary, I had to pick up books and learn it, is that it concerns an action in the past, but it brings kind of the past and present together. The verb system essentially is timeless. There's thinking more of the perspective of the author versus the actual belief in time. It's almost philosophical the way they argue it, and it's one of those minority reports within scholarship on Greek and linguistic theory and stuff like that. I suspect it'll be if you were to go to seminary, vocab, and you and I were to go to seminary in 20 years, we'd
have to learn it.
We would at least be taught what it is, how to engage with it, and all that sort of stuff.
Do you think Porter is going to be able to utilize its findings to go to bat, even if in a subtle way, for Pauline authorship of, say, the pastorals?
Yes, partially because I've got his massive commentary.
Let me see that. Should I get it?
Yes.
How much is it? So it looks like a $45 book.
Ooh,
is it one of those? Who's the publisher?
It's Baker Academic.
Okay, was it a $55 book?
The volume you picked up by Bach, it was originally going to be the Pastoral Epistles volume in there. In that series.
Okay, this?
Yeah, but because it got so big, standalone commentary, and he got to add his own stuff in there. When it was given to me, it was $70. I don't think it's $70 now. It's probably in the 40s. But your point about Porter and verbal aspect and the impact of Greek, he actually does put that to use, because in 2 Corinthians 5:16, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't have the text in front of me at the moment, Paul says something along the lines of, if we know someone according to Christ, we now no longer know him in this way, for if we knew Christ according to the flesh, but we no longer know him in this way, kind of thing.
Yeah, no longer regard anyone according to the flesh and all that.
Yeah. And Porter argues that the we know verb actually, and I don't have his monograph in front of me, but Rudolf Bultmann and other scholars famously said this does not refer to Paul knowing Jesus before in the flesh, before the Damascus Road experience, because of the tense of the verb. Porter says that's an old, badly dated, so it's not just dated, because things move. It is incorrect and dated, the understanding of time in Greek verbs. And he says it very possibly, and there are contextual factors as well, seems to suggest that the we know Christ according to the flesh no longer implies that Paul knew Jesus in his, quote, earthly ministry or earthly life.
Huh. I don't even think I ever considered that passage could possibly mean that Paul knew Jesus, but it could mean that, I guess.
Well, and then you've got the famous story, and Porter argues that the rich young ruler in the Gospels, teacher, I have kept all the law, and Jesus says, and depending which gospel you read, says something along the lines of, Jesus loved him and said, you lack one thing, go sell all your possessions, give it to the poor, and come follow me. And the man went away poor, or went away sad because he was very rich. Some people have argued, and I think Porter's among them, that the rich young ruler, his name was Paul, or Saul, depending on, the language.
Really? Where did he get that from?
I'd have to go back and read it. He says, look, it's an inference, but if we're looking for an actual recorded instance, the man's not named, the rich young ruler, he's not named, we don't have his name. It fits Paul's kind of way of thinking. It fits Pharisaical thought. It fits, being born in Tarsus. He was in Cilicia, which became a Roman colony, probably a generation or two before Paul was born there, if Acts is right, and Acts is right on that. Then you've got the issue, and this you can see where apologetics become so important here. It means that how did Paul get Roman citizenship? Well, he got it from his father, but his father had to have it given to him by his father. And Tarsus was a very wealthy area with a lot of philosophical schools. And Paul left that time. He actually was born there, but didn't live there very long. We don't know how long, but was brought up in Jerusalem at the feet of Gamaliel in Acts 22. If that's true, and I think it is, then you have someone who is probably rich enough to live in Jerusalem exclusively and follow his rabbi from a city that was a Roman colony that was full of philosophical schools, trade. It was a bustling, wonderful little city. Very good city. Think of it like a nicer, cleaner Tucson on the water, right? It's a really nice, well, I'm trying to think of another city.
Works for me. Okay.
Something like that. And Paul, and so it makes sense. You can see kind of, if you're willing to be like, okay, this is not unreasonable. I can see the logic of it. That'd be probably the one story where we could say that perhaps was St. Paul. And Mark probably has connections to St. Paul because Mark is mentioned, the name Mark is mentioned throughout the Pauline epistles in various ways.
Yeah, John Mark. Well, they're probably going to say, so I saw an interview with Lydia McGrew, and she said one of the 7, because her background's epistemology, and so she approaches New Testament scholarship that way. She says one of the 7 mistakes that New Testament scholars tend to make is these arguments from silence. She crafted it somewhat different, and I think she even said it along the lines of arguments from silence against the data. I think that's how she described it, if I'm not mistaken. And the reason why I say that is I'd love to entertain something like that, right? There's no problem with it, and it's historically plausible. But the second you did, it'd be, well, Paul would have surely mentioned that if that was the case. Everything, she kind of makes fun of Bart Ehrman. And by the way, should we be pronouncing it Ehrman or Ehrman?
I've heard it pronounced both ways. I'll just say it whatever way I say it, and if I ever meet him, I'll ask him.
Yeah, I hear like little debates about that, and people are like, oh. So Bart Ehrman a lot of times does the surely. And I think of these counterexamples, like the expulsion of the Jews from Rome. Luke mentions it, but the only other guy who mentions it is Suetonius. Tacitus doesn't mention it. Josephus doesn't mention it. No one else mentions it. Luke and Suetonius. So you would think Josephus, being a Jewish, surely he would have mentioned the expulsion of the Jews from the Rome. You know what I'm saying? So I find those arguments a lot of times. Like, for example, if Saul was from Tarsus, surely he would have mentioned it in his Philippians 3 credential list. Right? I mean, do you hear what I'm talking about? Do you see these arguments?
I see them all the time. It's one of the problems in New Testament study, specifically in Paul, is that it is the either or versus the both and. And there are some things that can't be a both and, right? Like you can't have blatant contradictions. Like, sorry, that just won't work. Paul is either, a this or a that. He's not both of them. You know what I mean? But it's one of those where if you look at Josephus wouldn't mention it because he's capitulated and betrayed the Jewish people and become basically a Roman citizen because he saw the handwriting on the wall. So it does him no good to mention it. The same reason too is, I've got 2 cats that are adopted, or actually they're strays that we literally pulled up off the streets. I've had those cats forever. I love those cats. You wouldn't know that until I literally just mentioned them right now. But these cats are a vital part of our lives, specifically because
Nick had cats, surely he would have mentioned it in his introduction. Surely. Yep. And by the way, the reason I'm pointing this out, everyone, is so for you, when you watch the History Channel, when you watch PBS Special, when you see one of those Easter specials, who was Jesus? Paul, the inventor of Christianity, in the news racks while you're waiting at Safeway. When you click on a video and you see this, I can't imagine a first century Jew saying such a thing. I got that the other day with Valiant. Always stop and think and say, well, is that right? A lot of, is that right for sure? Keep track of this, people, because I think it's very important, and I just want to point that out because, like I said, Tacitus, Roman historian, he doesn't mention the expulsion of the Jews. Now, that's just one example I'm just throwing out because I think it's insightful, and a lot of times we don't always know the reasons. Like we can speculate, well, maybe because of this, we don't always know, and history by its nature is selective because you can't put everything in there, and so it's almost like you'll see people. Lydia mentioned this one too. I liked it. Hold on. I'm not going to go. I'm going to get into gospel studies. I'm going to leave Paul, and so I don't.
I got a perfect example for you, Votan.
What do you got?
What do you got? There's Kazimon, his commentary on Romans. One of the better theological kind of commentaries on Romans. If you can find it for a cheap price, don't run out of your way to get it. In here, in chapter 9 and verse 5, the famous, is it Christ overall, God forever blessed, or is it the Messiah overall, blessed be God, or something like that? Is the Messiah called God is basically the issue. And he says this one thing, and I've never been angrier, and I'm not saying it's right for me to feel that way, but I've never been angrier when I read this sort of thing. And this is the issue, and this is why I mentioned George Footmore, Krister Stendahl, E.P. Sanders, Jimmy Dunn, all of them, right? Like there's this line of succession. The issue is, you will see lines used or slogans or axiom used in New Testament scholarship, specifically with Pauline scholarship, that get repeated almost not quite verbatim, but the theme or the concept gets kind of recapitulated when it comes to the text, right? So Kazimon in that section says, I'm trying to find the exact phrase. Okay, so, and I'm reading from this. This is from his Romans commentary. This is page 250 of the English translation because I don't have the German with me. The apostle never directly calls Christ God, let alone the emphatic ha epi panton theos, God over all, which would be hard to imagine in view of the subordinationism in 1 Corinthians 15:28 and following. It can hardly be accepted then that in an extreme paradox anticipating the later doctrine of the two natures, so you can see he's already not asking the right questions, the two doctrine of the two natures, he is according this title to the earthly Messiah of Israel. Basically, Paul can't be calling the Messiah God because elsewhere he says he's subordinate to God or something like that.
Right.
You kind of go, okay, hold on. You could just argue, like J. Christian Becker, that Paul is just inconsistent and Paul says both things. That is very common too. But for those of us who are
if you're not an
reading,
ineritist, that's a possible option, for
and
example.
Becker wasn't or isn't. He's not. He doesn't have that problem. He's like, Paul says that and Paul says that. Try and put them together is kind of his joke. For me, it's like, well, as someone who doesn't like loose ends and tries to make things fit, not force, but, to do these things fit. There's the idea that Paul would call the Messiah God is such a shocking thing. Yes, but it is not out of concert with Second Temple Judaism and exalted figures, and even the Davidic Son of Man, or the Daniel Son of Man, the Daniel conception of the Son of Man, right? And all these sorts of things. And so it's one of those where I just kind of go, just because it's shocking means absolutely nothing to your modern sensibilities.
Right.
And what I mean by that, and
because
they said it well,
real quick, because guys, you got to understand how radical a lot of what Paul and Jesus and all that, what they were saying, what they were doing, it is shocking. That's kind of the point. But go ahead.
Well, and these guys will say, for example, Matthew Thiessen in A Jewish Paul, he'll say something like, make Paul weird again. Let Paul say things, and he would be, he's a Christian, but he's close. I think he's a Christian. I actually don't know. I think he is. But he's certainly not an evangelical, we'll say that. But he says, you need to let Paul be weird.
Yeah.
And Paul will say things that don't make sense to us. Kind of like what Michael Heiser says. The Bible's not written for you. Why on earth would you go there going like, oh, I know everything? It's like, of course you don't. You're 2,000 years later. You have Wi-Fi. You're looking at what I'm saying on Wi-Fi. Paul didn't have Wi-Fi, and all that sort of stuff. And so one of the big issues in just Pauline scholarship is just this kind of modern narcissism. And I struggle with it too, so I'm not singling out people as if this doesn't apply to me. It's kind of this modern narcissism of a first century Jew can't say weird things. And I'm like, well, they said them all the time. Have you read, I don't know, First Enoch? Have you read Wisdom of Solomon? Have you read
even the Dead Sea Scrolls? Yep,
exactly. And so it's just one of those things. If you allow Paul to be weird and you allow that Paul is coherent, I'm not saying he's a systematic theologian, but you allow Paul to be baseline coherent, the study of Paul becomes a lot more fruitful, and the apologetics enterprise becomes a lot more helpful if you just weren't entertaining those questions.
See, that's good advice right there, man. I think that's common sense, and I wish it could be approached more, and I think that's exactly right. I appreciate what you just said there. That's very helpful, and that's exactly right. Let's just do a few more books, and then audience, I need some questions from you.
Ooh, I got a book for you, Vocab.
Yeah, what you got?
I don't know if you've read it, so I apologize if you haven't read this, but it just came out. Let's see. There we go. Can you read that?
Yeah, remember I told you I was reading that.
Yeah, and so
that's a great book. It can get a little confusing because it has different perspectives in it, and you got to keep track of who's saying what. I'm
in the weird spot. So for those who know, Michael Bird, the editor and contributor in here, is my PhD supervisor. David Rudolph is a Messianic Jew, and he does a response to Scott McKnight, Ben Witherington, and Michael Bird.
Yeah, see, I got
David. Yep.
Yeah, that's a good book.
David Rudolph is part of what's called the Post-Supersessionist Society, and that is basically a society of Jews and Christians, Messianic Jews and Christians, who are committed to a post-supersessionistic reading of Israel in the New Testament. That is to say that I don't want to brutalize what they say. So let me super.
Yeah, I think I read his at least one of his chapters so far. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah. The problem is for me, Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology. And so at a time of Israel and war and conflict and all the stuff that we all can look and see, this book has risen up in my reading. But here's the thing: my master's mentor, when I was doing my master's at Fuller, is a guy named Tommy Givens, who's part of that society and is actively involved in that sort of question. So I am a man of two hearts at this point, because Mike is on one side and Tommy is on the other. So I'm reading this book with a little bit of trepidation. So here's how they describe it. The Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology exists in order, and I'm not promoting them, I'm just, that advances post-supersessionist thought. The society understands post-supersessionism as a family of theological perspectives that affirms God's irrevocable covenant with the Jewish people as a central and coherent part of ecclesial teaching. It seeks to overcome understandings of the new covenant that entail the abrogation or obsolescence of God's covenant with the Jewish people, of the Torah as a demarcator of Jewish communal identity, or of the Jewish people themselves. And so agree or disagree, you can hear the cruel silence of Auschwitz and the ghettos in the background of that sort of statement. And so basically ever since ever since Auschwitz and Nazi Germany, again, to bring it full circle with Karl Barth and political theology of today and empire studies, as you know, vocab, these sorts of things are immensely necessary to talk about because of their immediate ethical, theological, and interpersonal impact. And specifically, I mean, you see it with Black Hebrew Israelites, you see it with all that sort of stuff, but even just figuring out how the church should speak about this is immensely complex and stuff. So that's what I think a book that I think a lot of more people should be reading, just because it's a question we need to answer because we see it on our nightly news. And
yeah, I like that book so far, getting through it. So speaking of God and Empire Studies, here's a kind of a pop level introduction by J.D. Crossan. What do you think of the Paul? And shout out, by the way, to Chris, apologist in Detroit. I had him on, and he was one of the other people I was talking to a lot in the lead up to the debate. I really appreciate Chris's insight. Shout out to Chris. What do you think of J.D. Crossan in relationship to Paul? Because he has a more academic one. I forgot the title of it off the top of my head, but this is like the pop level introduction to it.
Like most things with Crossan and most scholars, eat the meat, spit out the bones. But there's some pretty decent meat in there.
All right, so that's Crossan. What about, in general, Ehrman and Paul?
Ehrman's a little idiosyncratic with Paul. I generally don't recommend people. If you want an actual critical reading of Paul, read someone like a Douglas Campbell or a Beverly.
What's the book
Gaventa.
title? Give us the book titles of those two you'd recommend for entry.
Gosh. Well, a good one on the study of Paul would be something like this. The Four Views on Paul.
Yeah.
Just to give you kind of, a little, get your feet wet, but with that book, read the footnotes. Because Douglas Campbell's got a 1,400-page book. I'm not going to recommend that because it's obnoxious to read, and he admits it now, about 10 years later. But yeah, I'd recommend that Four Views on Paul just to get a sense of the terrain and kind of build your bibliography after that.
Okay, almost just a few left. Hey, look at that, bro!
I knew you were going for it.
That's crazy. That's crazy.
First edition's still fantastic. I recommend it. It's outdated, but in the best sense of the word.
Well, I think so. I've got the Logos now, and the Logos is. Let me make sure it's the updated version. I'm pretty sure it is. So I have it digitally, and I believe it's. What do you think of the in general, though, Paul and his letters, the dictionary?
That's fantastic. It's really helpful. They tend to be very neutral. Obviously, there's some that are tilted, but by and large, really, really helpful. You'll get kind of the meat of it, and the most helpful part of that is the bibliography at the end of each little entry. I think Mike actually does the article in there on supersessionism, which I haven't read yet. I've read his chapter in here. I haven't read his actual entry.
That makes sense.
I did read the one on universalism by Ian Paul. That was very, very helpful for doctoral work.
All right, so let's get to some questions now. You ready?
Sure.
Ham Sunshine. Oh wait, first I just realized, Patriots for Christ. You gave a super chat. Patriots for Christ. I see you, brother. Yep, right there. Patriots for Christ. Thank you. And he says, Happy New Year. Adrian, you ready?
That's a good guy.
That's from Patriots for Christ, Adrian. All right, she appreciates that. Okay, so let's get to some audience questions here. We are talking to Reverend Nick Quint, New Testament theologist on YouTube, talking Pauline studies, trying to give you guys a general sense of the field right now. This is really trying to be not a hardcore analysis or critique of the field. Probably have to talk to like Lydia McGrew or someone else like that for something like that. This is more just like a general, relatively neutral-ish, not, friendly type of introduction type thing. I'll throw some questions out at you. Hopefully they're relevant. Give me a Q and a question mark, people, so I know it's a question. Best book to answer Rabbi Tovia Singer, Isaiah 53 response, where he says, "The servant is the nation of Israel." Can I?
Please.
Hold on, because I got. Let's see here. I
I'm
recommend.
tell people to go look at Radar Apologetics. That's usually what I tell people.
Yeah, Radar Apologetics. If you want a book, Brown's book, The Real Kosher Jesus, is one I'd recommend, as well as, hold on, I got another Brown book I'll show you in a second here. But also, I think Bach is involved with a book that's all about Isaiah 53.
That
Um,
I don't know. I'm not as well read on Isaiah 53. My
okay.
supervisor calls it Isaiah. I know William Lane Craig just did a book on penal substitution, and he tackles that concept as well with the servants versus Christ, or Christ, or the Christ as
Here
prophecy,
we
or the
go.
servant. So
The,
yeah,
the Gospel according to Isaiah 53, Encountering the Suffering Servant in Jewish and Christian Theology, March 2012, edited by Block and Glaser. But go ahead. Sorry.
no, that's probably a perfectly fine book. I've not done as much reading on Isaiah 53 and atonement stuff. That's just one of those I just haven't got into it. I remember reading in seminary that I came to the conclusion that both the Christ as prophecy reading and then the servant reading were actually not incompatible with one another.
Right.
Um, I I don't I don't I don't have really an issue either way. I Yeah, I'd have to do a lot more work
Okay.
on that specific text in order to have a actual reasoned opinion on it. I just have a gut feeling at the end of it.
No problem. And we got another super chat from Jay Fry. Thank you, Jay Fry. Adrian, you ready? Thank you for supporting the channel. This is what I got to do, man. I'm sorry. I know it.
No, by all means, dogs gotta get fed.
Yep, and from Jonathan Soko, shout out to you, brother. He provides the beats for this channel too, and so whenever we freestyle, it's usually thanks to Jonathan Soko. All right, so we're hooking her up. Okay, here's the next one, Kairos. What's your initial thoughts when you come across so many Christians on social media insisting that Paul's writing are lies and not inspired by God?
This is gonna sound weird. I don't usually run in circles of people that say that. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, of course. That's just not. This is going to sound weird. I just don't come across people that actually say that. I'm talking with scholars, pastors, lay people. I talk, with everyone. I find I would need, perhaps there's a specific statement behind that. What they mean by lies, or do they mean like what we talked about, the so-called Deutero-Pauline corpus and stuff like that? Is that kind of what the question is kind of getting at?
Well, I see people upset about Paul's ethics a lot.
Yeah.
That's an example, I think. I see
Okay,
people
so
upset about their view or understanding about what they believe that he is saying about women.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
Those
yeah.
are some things, that I see people kind of getting, upset about. Maybe, I don't know if that's what they mean or anything like that.
Yeah. Okay, so that helps. Yeah, it's usually, and here's the thing I don't like, and I actually see this in some evangelical scholarship on the right as well. There is this tendency to, when a text doesn't fit, you will adopt some of the most esoteric ways of solving the issue. For example, saying Paul didn't write it, or there's a text, or what have you, or they're not inspired by God. However, most evangelicals that I talk to, whether in the church, in the academy, or both, the debate is usually more something along the lines of, well, there's debate on this question, and we need to solve the debate before we can even determine what he's saying. Which in my mind is an entirely fair point. It's okay. Well, we need to figure out if he wrote it, and if he wrote it, then how do we put all this together? It's kind of seems to me a fairly reasonable question. But I mean, I see enough people, dudes on TikTok, progressive pastors, and them saying stuff like, did you know Paul didn't actually write the pastorals? I'm like, did you know a lot of people say lots of things that are relevant and stupid on social media? Christians and non-Christians too.
Right.
Did you know that? And so it's one of those, at the end of the day, I just have to determine, is this person worth the mental energy that it'll take to engage with them? And half the time that's only the Lord can really tell you that.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. Do you recommend any archaeological sources or channels regarding Paul in the New Testament specifically? Thanks for being here.
No, not because there aren't good ones, but because I just don't know them.
All right. Hold on. Let me see here. Let me give you one book there, purely grounded. The Popular Handbook of Archaeology in the Bible. Holden and Geisler, discoveries that confirm the reliability of Scripture. That's a book I'd recommend.
Jerome Murphy O'Connor. You'll have to go look for the specific title of it, but he does stuff on Corinth, where he does texts and archaeology and stuff like that. I don't. It's some sort of title like that. But he was a very famous New Testament scholar who was in Jerusalem for his entire academic career. So that'd be one I'd recommend, because I remember reading through it in seminary, being like, "This is fantastic." I just, for some reason, I'm blanking on the name of it, but it's a dated but very helpful book. And there would be another thing. anything by Bruce Longnecker.
No, hold on. Isn't it?
You probably have it.
Isn't it Richard Longenecker?
Richard Longnecker, I think, is his dad.
Oh, so it's two. Really? So this is Bruce Longenecker's dad?
I think so. It's pronounced Longnecker, but it's spelled Longenecker.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And Necker.
Because I got his Acts commentary. Okay, fascinating. Go ahead. I'm listening.
But he's done a bunch of stuff on like Pompeii and kind of archaeology and kind of old texts and inscriptions and stuff. But Bruce Longnecker out of Baylor University would be really good on that. And I don't have any of them on my shelf to show you like something like this, but
just... And then, where did it go? Oh yeah. There's a channel I do want to recommend. You asked about a channel. There's a channel called The Land in the Bible, and I'm not sure who the gentleman actually is. I don't know his name, but man, he's really good. And the title of this video is actually let me see here. Is Paul a reliable source? That's actually the title of the video. I was just watching this the other day. Incredible archaeological find linked to Apostle Paul. So he gets into things like the Erastus inscription and, of course, the Gallio inscription and the Delphi inscription, and explains those at a very helpful level in like 7-minute videos. So I'd recommend that channel, The Land in the Bible, with that. If someone could find that link, that'd be good. Nate asks this: what is the Academy?
It is usually confined to specific societies. You have SBL, Society of Biblical Literature, and that's paired with AAR, which is American Academy of Religion. You put it together, you get SPLAR, if you're a nerd like me. You also have ETS, Evangelical Theological Society. So the Academy is usually kind of confined around those three societies, and they're full of thousands and thousands of people. And within that, you've got, Evangelical Theological Society. You have all sorts of societies.
I think ETS, we got 2,000, and I think SBL's like 8,000 or 9,000.
Yeah, something like that. ETS
What's
is
AAR?
smaller.
Do you know the size of AAR?
AAR is probably closer to maybe like 4,000, my guess. So you put SPLAR together, that's probably 10,000 people, 12,000 people.
I always tell the story. I'll probably tell it till I die, and it's because it's so true. But I feel like if someone told it to me, I'd be like, no one did that. Stop lying. But it happened to me, so it's not that big of a deal to someone watching this. But true story. I'm at ETS. This is my first year there. I didn't really know when SBL versus when ETS met. I didn't understand who met first or second at this point, right? It was my first year. I'm on the elevator, and it's towards the end of ETS. It's like the last day. We had stayed over and stuff, and I'm on the elevator in the hotel where it takes place at. And there's some gals, like 3 ladies, old middle-aged ladies who clearly look like professorial types. Like I thought in my head, and I'm with a David Wood or one of those guys. I don't remember who I was with, John McCrae, and they weren't talking or nothing. They're not going to talk to a stranger. But to me, I try to talk to people when I'm at these events as much as I can. I find everything's interesting. So I'm like, oh yeah, you guys here for the conference too, and stuff. And I see you got some books, right, this and that. I'm like, oh, that's cool, yeah. So did you guys present at ETS? And she goes, ETS? I was like, yeah, because she's like, we try to stay as far away from those people as possible, and hold her bag tighter and goes close to the door, and so the second it opens can go out. And I was just like, what? She literally scrunched up like this and moved to the side closer to her group and said, we try to stay as far away from those people as possible. And she understood I was one of them when she saw my badge stuff. They weren't really paying attention. I was like, there's no way that really, she literally said that and literally did that. And I'm like, that's crazy, bro. That's crazy, bro. Now, I know everyone wouldn't act that way, but these 3 certainly did.
Yeah, no, it's ETS or evangelicals are viewed very segregationally, if I can say it like that, compared to SBL. Although most of the people at SBL or at ETS go to SBL too. My favorite SBL ETS, actually I didn't go to ETS, I went to SBL, just the timing didn't work out. And this was in San Diego, 3-4 years ago. Last time they were in San Diego. They'll be in San Diego this year, which I'm totally going because
I love the San Diego ones. They're my favorite.
Oh, so much fun. And I saw Richard Hayes, Duke Divinity School, one of the premier Pauline scholars.
Morals of Paul and ethical vision and all that.
Yep, Echoes of Paul in the Letters of Scripture, or Echoes of Scripture in the Letters of Paul. Echoes of Scripture in the Gospels is his new big fat book, which is great. He was mobbed by people. He had like 5 or 6 people around him, and it was like for an hour. And I think I was waiting for Mike to finish something, and I was just sitting outside. And then, we walked by, and I went back downstairs because, the convention center is 2 stories. I went back downstairs, and I forgot something. So as I'm going back up, I see Dr. Hayes beginning to like try to, you can tell he's old, not old, like bad old, but just, I'm tired, leave me alone. I've had a full day, just let me go. And he's
when I ran into D.A. Carson, I got the same vibe at ETS, but go ahead.
Oh, yeah. As we're passing, I held up my hand to go, and he kind of looked at me with like this, oh, hi, but please no. Like you could tell, and I just went, nice to meet you, Dr. Hayes, as we're passing. And he kind of, nice to meet you too, Nick. Because he read it, right. Like, nice to meet you too, Nick. And he wouldn't know me if I, watched his dog. He wouldn't know me. Right. So I walked by, and I'm like, I'm going to keep that one for my life. That was fun.
Yeah, it's funny because you go there and people that would probably most certainly were like nerds in school and got picked on. They're like celebrities at ETS, and certain ones of them are celebrities at like ETS and stuff like that's funny.
Oh,
like,
it's weird.
That's what they look like? What? And you start to be like...
Well, you see Simon Gathercole, and Simon Gathercole is like 6'7". Like, he's a big, tall dude. Then you see Mike Berg, who's, he's what? Your average height?
Yeah,
like
he's a small guy.
Yeah, then you see N.T. Wright, who's about 6 foot, and you're just like...
You remember when I saw Tom Schreiner, I was like, where's his chin?
Be nice. I'm going to see him at ETS in San Diego this year. At the regional thing is in San Diego, and hopefully, if my paper gets accepted, he'll show up because I know he's interested in Pauline Universalism. So
he's still my favorite New Testament theologian. Okay, so that's what the Academy is, and then we've got Kairos. Some Hebrew Israelite camps do not accept Paul's writings as God-inspired. Thank you for addressing my question. You want to briefly mention that, though? Like, what do you say when people would try to say Paul's not inspired? So that's a theological question, but what do you say about that or get into with that?
I would look at them and say, all right, with the exception of maybe the pastorals, and so I'll bracket those. Actually, no, screw it. I'll include them. There is no good academic reason to think that Paul didn't write these epistles. Like, there's just no good academic reason for it. The language is not that dissimilar. The life setting is not that dissimilar. The theology is not that dissimilar. They all present as, very as incalculably Pauline. And so you have to take them as within a singular author. You have amanuensis, which is called, or a scribe. So Paul clearly has scribes. He greets them. The scribe greets us in Romans 16. Tertius basically says, hi, how you doing, at the end of Romans. And so I would say, first of all, there's no good reason to accept the consensus that these writings are not written by Paul. And so that's one issue right there. Some people do not accept Paul's writings as God-inspired. I just go, okay, great. On what basis do you make this claim? Like, give me an actual reason, because, 2 Peter seems to suggest that all of Scripture is inspired by God, and Paul even writes that of himself. All of Scripture is inspired by God. Paul appeals to Scripture as authoritative and uses it. Paul's letters are basically the lifeblood of the early church movement in terms of what we know of the church and how the church was structured and how the church was troubled in its own ways with sexual ethics and ethnic conflict and class issues and stuff. I just go, look, there's just no reason to accept the kind of standard scholarly claim. Then on top of that, I would say that theologically, to make that claim is basically to fall into, and I'm being intentional with what I say here, an argumentation and a worldview that only comes from white liberal Protestantism.
That is true.
And so it's not to say it's false, but it's to say, hey, look, the only people making these claims do not share your values on any real regard. So basically I would say, how do you square that, with them, so to speak. And so that's not, and I would avoid just a question of inerrancy or inspiration, just because at that point we're not even prepared to have that kind of conversation. You know what I mean? It's just, we're talking fundamentally about different things. So that's how I'd try to begin the conversation. I'd be a little less combative than I am right now, but that's generally my approach to things.
Helpful. Appreciate that. Nate says, did not the apostles have a right to take along a believing Wi-Fi?
For a second, I'm like, Nate did not just write believing waifu. I was like, Nate, I swear that's
Because when you
Wi-Fi.
when you said Paul didn't have Wi-Fi, that's his response there.
Yeah, only Nate.
And JSoul1 recommends a podcast, as does Apologist in Detroit. Thank you for both of those. Joel asks, New Perspective has turned out to be new perspectives. Can you share a bit about the different perspectives on Paul?
So you've got the old perspective, which would be like a Thomas Schreiner. You've got the new perspective, which would be N.T. Wright. Yep. You've got the apocalyptic Paul, which would be yours truly, but on a more prominent level, someone like a Douglas Campbell or a Jamie Davis, or Davies, I should say. He's at Trinity College in Bristol, UK. And then for a Jewish Paul, or the Pauline Judaism, you have Paula Fredrickson and Matthew Thiessen. The question most prominently boils down to, what is Paul's epistemology? How does that work with the Christ event? And how does that impact his ethnic self-conception and how he thinks about the ethnicity of others? So those are kind of the three questions that, and then of course, the old perspective was concerned, with sin and guilt. The apocalyptic perspective is more cosmic than that. But those three questions are kind of where all three or four schools of Pauline thought kind of converge and diverge. And so new perspective, basically at the end of the day, was basically throwing us back to the first century, saying your average Jew was not a Roman Catholic and was not a liturgical person, was not a faith, works or something like that. Generally speaking, there are exceptions, of course, but those are kind of the issues on the perspectives on Paul. Yeah.
This one we may not be able to answer because I don't know who these people really are. Dare I ask your opinion of Callistus Ware's writings or Anthony Bloom's?
Don't know Anthony Bloom. Callistus Ware is an Eastern Orthodox. I don't know if he's a priest or a theologian or both. Very helpful if you want to learn more about Eastern Orthodoxy. My wife had a few books of Bishop Callistus Ware.
Oh, wait, yeah. Timothy Ware, too. He goes by Timothy, doesn't he?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, okay. He has got a Penguin Introduction to Eastern Orthodoxy and some other stuff, too. Okay, so okay, I do know that is. Okay, I don't know Anthony Bloom is, though.
As a Baptist, I learned quite a bit, and after reading it, I'm still a Baptist. So
works for me. Okay. Speaking of Penguin stuff, well, I brought this up the other day. This is totally off subject. The letters of Pliny the Younger. And you were saying that it's better to understand the deaconesses there, not as deaconesses as in a position, but simply to understand them as servants or slaves, correct?
Actually, the opposite.
The opposite. Because I was making an argument that I was saying evidence for female deacons, but I thought you were saying no.
I must have misheard you then. I meant to say it calls them ministre, which is not slave but deacon. So I was trying to bolster your point, I think is what I was trying to say.
Oh, okay. But wait, I guess I was under the impression, and that maybe I'm getting both with the same word. They were servants or slaves and deacons, but you're saying it's the word's only informing you about one thing?
I'd have to look. I don't have the original text in front of me, but the text does say ministre, which would be something like deacon, or if you translate it literally, something like minister or something like that.
Because I understood them to be deacons, but I guess I thought they were also identified maybe separately as servants or slaves as far as occupation. But it might be one or the other. Maybe.
No, it could be both. I was only focused on ministry. I thought for some reason I thought someone had said it was something else.
Well, maybe someone did, but I was saying, yeah, I'm a complementarian, but I'm a complementarian who holds that female deacons, and this was extra canonical evidence in my view, if it's to be understood that way properly.
Yeah, I think it's good support for that. Yeah, and it's early too. It's Pliny's. That's pretty early. That's within probably 50 years of Paul, which is quite good.
No doubt. White Lily says, what made you so interested in the Apostle Paul and the different perspectives on Paul?
Oh, good question. And we don't have forever, so I'll make this.
That's true.
Short.
We don't. We got a few minutes.
What I liked about Paul is that Paul was a deep thinker who was capable of incredible abstract thought and theologizing and thinking like that, but was also immensely practical in that he cared about his churches, he cared about his people, he cared about holiness, he cared about the gospel. And for him, what I love about him so much is that he's a holistic thinker that is struggling with conflict. Every epistle we have of his, with the exception perhaps of Ephesians, is filled with conflict and combativeness and sexual issues and racism and classism and economics and exploitation and stuff. And so for me, Jesus is the one on which Paul is building a theology upon for the church. But for me, I think Paul is so interesting just because we have such divergent literature to such divergent casts of people that it's hard to construct a systematic theology of Paul. But when you do it, it's a lot of fun to do. And so I think I just like the challenge of Paul. I think, in my experience, I just think Paul's often misunderstood, but when he's understood right, he is absolutely vital for the life of the church, specifically as it relates to sexual ethics and holiness.
Have you seen the lecture by N.T. Wright? He's given it a couple different places, including Duke. Paul, the inventor of New Testament or Christian theology.
Christian theology, yeah.
Why Paul had to invent.
I listened to it a while back, yeah.
I thought that was pretty good. I listened to it, two different versions of it last week, even though it's like 9 years old, at least the ones I was listening to. And I thought it was helpful when he said in every letter Paul stresses unity and holiness, and his load-bearing theological enterprise that he's doing in the letters is to get to those goals or to serve those ends for those purposes. And so it's kind of like why Paul had to invent Christian theology. I thought it was fascinating. I liked it, though.
Yeah, it's a really good lecture.
J Soul 1 says, do you think if we removed all the books credited to Paul, we would still have the same theology from the other New Testament books?
I think we would. The emphases would be different. But
yeah. I feel like there'd be like a percentage. I feel like there'd have to be something missing, I feel like. But it seems like... go ahead, though. I'm curious what you would say.
In terms of holiness, no, you have James and Hebrews. You have the exalted Christology of Hebrews and James or John. You have the economic exploitation critique, which Paul uses in Revelation. You have Paul's view of gender, which is coordinate with the book of Revelation and Hebrews and other sorts of texts. You have the issue of priesthood, of that sort of thing in Peter. And I'm not talking Roman Catholic priesthood, but I'm talking about kind of the priesthood of all believers, that sort of thing.
the Lutheran understanding, for lack of a better phrase. Yeah, I think. But what about justification? I feel like we... this will sound weird. I feel like we wouldn't have to work as hard to systemize New Testament soteriology, but I feel like it would be not as robust, to say the least.
I actually don't think so. Justification language is utilized in the other text often, but it just doesn't use dikaiosune or that word group, justification word group as often. But the concepts there, specifically as it relates to faith language, because faith is usually connected to virtue lists or fruits of the Spirit. The one thing you might not have, now that I think about it, would be the charismatic gifts, or at least kind of that robust sort of construct, what the gifts are and stuff like that. Specifically in relation to ecclesiology, because pneumatology, the doctrine of the Spirit, and ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church, Paul in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14 and Romans 12 and Ephesians 4 takes both concepts and just smashes them together. And I mean smashes them together in a way that is shocking and helpful and very integrative. You wouldn't quite get the charismatic gifts as strongly if you took out Paul. That'd be my only thing where I think you would have a little more difficulty kind of doing that. But I think you could still find them, just not, it wouldn't be as overt. Justification, I think you'd be able to find, it would just take on a more distinct flair, specifically from the Gospels.
Gotcha.
But I still think faith would be as prominent as it is in Paul, as it is.
Well, a few things, everyone. Listen, number one, I see J Soul dropped the super chat. Thank you very much. I don't know. Let's see if you're going to be the last one. You may or may not be, but shout out to all the super chatters. You get some love. And Adrian gets some love. That's right. She knows what's up. She's excited. Oh, wow. Okay, relax there. Thank you, Jay Soul. And listen up, though. I'm most likely going to go live again tonight, maybe in a few hours, with Anthony Rogers. And we're going to talk about the pre-Christian Paul and his bio in general and issues related to historiography, the historical Paul. Or that's the plan. So the plan is, I know I don't have it already loaded up on the channel, but I got to talk to Andy one more time to confirm. But it looks like that is going to happen. There are more questions, but guys, I don't think I'm going to be able to get to those other questions. I'm sorry. And we're definitely not going to be able to play clips like I was hoping at one point. But I do appreciate you joining, and I do hope everyone goes to your channel and at least, if nothing else, listens to when you interviewed me on your channel recently.
That was best interview of all time.
That's right. But thanks for joining us. I appreciate your insight and all the help and all of that kind of stuff. We do wish you well with the family and upcoming baseball season. Are you a Padres fan? Are you a Dodgers fan?
I'm a Dodgers fan, but I grew up watching the Angels and the Padres and the Rangers. So for me, I called last year, the past 2 seasons, I've been a Dodgers and a Rangers fan because I feel I need a foot in both conferences, just so I have people to watch when the other one's playing. And it was a good year for the Rangers. So we went.
They beat the Arizona Diamondbacks.
Started at the bottom. Now we're rings at the top, baby. But I wouldn't be surprised if y'all repeat, because that Arizona team is not fun to play against. I got a lot of love for the Arizona team.
That was a pretty amazing season. I'm still at heart, number one, still a Reds guy, being from Ohio. I picked the Cincinnati Reds. But D-backs is right up there, It's how it is when you lived in 2 places. But
and Cincinnati is just such a good baseball area. Like that's
totally.
Just I'd love
they closed down everything for opening day there. It's not like some cities. I don't know if any others. They have like parades downtown. It's a whole thing. I don't know how many cities do that for opening day the way Cincinnati does it.
Definitely not Los Angeles. I don't know how you would even accomplish that.
It's LA. I mean,
Yeah.
All right, we got a Dodgers fan here too. I'm sorry, I like the Dodgers history, but being in Arizona, I hate the Dodgers. I just hate them.
No, I can understand that. That's just me. I get it.
Got a Red Sox fan. Red Sox, okay, Red Sox. And a Mets fan. I like the Mets. I always like the Mets. I like the
Mets. I got a lot of love for the Mets.
And they got an A's fan talking about the A's of Vegas. They're going to be constantly playing in front of other teams' fans.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
I think that'd be a good baseball stadium. Vegas, drive down to Phoenix. Like that's actually a nice little rivalry right there, I think.
Yeah, it ain't bad. All right, well, I appreciate you coming on, man, and for all your work and all that, and taking time away from the family. Hope you have some beautiful family time, and Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you as well, and dubs up for Adrian. It's a good dog you got there.
Oh yeah,
Phillies? Whatever. Oh, okay.
I like the Phillies too. There's only a few teams I hate.
Astros. That's the other one.
Astros, but a couple of
Cheaters.
All right, man. Let's talk again. God bless everyone. Be sure to come back tonight if we do something where we make apologetics fun again.
Ask Anthony if Paul knew Jesus in his earthly life, as I mentioned earlier.
Okay.
I'd be curious to get his thoughts.
All right, appreciate that. All right, God bless. Peace out. Have a good night, everybody. Talk to you soon.
Street apologist.